All right, I feel like that's enough time for some of the stragglers here. As I mentioned, we do have quite a lot of content to cover today, so I'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to today's webinar, Choosing the JavaScript Framework for Your Next Enterprise-Grade Application. We have a ton of different JavaScript frameworks that we're going to be taking a look at, so let's go ahead and kick things off. Now, first of all, just in case you're wondering who is on the line here, who's telling you all this lovely information today. My name is Carl Bergenhem, and I am the product manager for Kendo UI. If you haven't heard of Kendo UI before, it's a JavaScript framework and UI library specifically that allows you to integrate grids, charts, whatever it might be, advanced UI components into any application. So we'll cover some of the frameworks actually that we integrate with, and I'll mention that just briefly at the end. The main work that I do is with Progress, and you can find me at Carl Bergenhem on Twitter. Now, some of you might be asking, who is Progress? Well, Progress is the leading .NET and JavaScript UI component vendor. So this is home of Kendo UI, and some of you might have heard of the Telerik UI components. And we offer UI components for jQuery, AngularJS, and Angular, React, and Vue, and actually some additional integration points as well through some unofficial bridges that we have available. Now, we also have UI components for ASP.NET Ajax, ASP.NET MVC, and ASP.NET Core. And then for some more .NET and almost desktop-like applications, we have WinForms, WPF, Universal Windows Platform, and Xamarin components as well. You might have also heard of Fiddler. That's one of the products that is available under our sort of umbrella, as well as an automated testing tool called Test Studio. We're also the creators of NativeScript, which is a JavaScript-based cross-platform native mobile application framework. That's a mouthful, but essentially it's a framework that allows you to use JavaScript, TypeScript, Angular, or Vue to develop truly native mobile applications with access to 100% of the APIs that you might have need of integrating into any iOS and Android application. All right, but enough about that. Let's kind of take a look at the agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. So first of all, I'm going to step through what are we going to be covering for each library. We actually have quite a lot of libraries, so I can't really spend a ton of time on each individual library and really make a deep dive into each library, right? Then we'll be covering Angular. For those of you that haven't taken a look at that yet, we'll be taking a look at React, Vue, Ember, and Aurelia. And after that, we'll kind of wrap up with the Q&A. So for those of you that have questions, you can feel free to type it away. You'll see in the GoToWebinar client, there's a little chat box. If I am not answering your questions during the webinar, I'm not ignoring you. I'm just simply saving the questions till the end. So feel free to type questions as we go along here. And at the end, I'll go ahead and kind of take some time and address those. One question that I know might be popping up is the session going to be recorded? Yes, we are recording this, so it will be available for later consumption on YouTube. Additionally, any of the code samples that I'll be walking through, I'll have a GitHub repository as well in the description of that video that you can kind of look into and jump into and start playing around with as well. So we'll be jumping into some code. So for each of the libraries, what we'll do is a quick overall history, the overall usage of the framework, and I essentially took just a couple quick stats that could indicate the health of the overall framework and kind of give you an idea of how big the community is, some of the core concepts for each library, the getting started experience, and then I'll jump into a code sample and kind of go through the same type of application and how it's been developed in each one of these libraries. So to kick things off, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Angular. So some history for Angular. First of all, right, everybody kind of more or less knows, right, it's created by Google. Originally, it was released as AngularJS, so you have the 1.x version, right, that some of us are familiar with. The initial release for Angular, so the 2.x release, was on September 14th in 2016. So Angular by itself hasn't necessarily been around a ton of time, right? An initial release of preview, alpha, and beta versions, of course, existed in 2015. But around this time in 2016 is when we really started to get some decent action coming out of the 2.x release. It was initially referred to as AngularJS 2 or 2.0, whatever it might be, but now they kind of rebranded, so you just have Angular for anything 2+. So they're currently actually on version 4.4.1, and there's a 5.x version in beta. So at the time of this recording, this is kind of where we are. In case anybody's wondering, no, you didn't miss version 3 because it was skipped. The Angular router was actually written a couple times and scrapped and rewritten, and the Angular router was on version 3. So in order to be able to kind of sync everything up, they jumped from 2.x into 4.x, and that's kind of where we are today. Now, some usage stats for Angular. So I've took the approach of working with GitHub. I'm also taking a look at the overall NPM download history, as well as some of the developer tools that are available for each library. So for Angular, you're looking at about 27,000 stars on GitHub. You also have 1.7 million NPM downloads per month. Now, some of this might, of course, just be development machine and some mirrors, etc. But these are just kind of some quick stats to get an idea of just how popular the library is. And 1.7 million NPM downloads per month is quite a lot. And we have about 127,000 downloads of Augury, which is a developer tool extension for Chrome that allows you to work with and inspect various aspects of an Angular application. So this can kind of give you an idea of how large the library is, right? Because stars on GitHub, overall commits and contributors can of course vary, but NPM downloads is very telling for just how often the library gets used. So this is something good to keep in mind here. Now, some of the core concepts, and a disclaimer here, I'm not going to be able to cover every single core concept, and I'm probably not going to make you an Angular or Vue or React or Aurelia or Ember expert from this webinar. What I'm trying to sort of do here is give you some idea of how the different frameworks, how they kind of function and what they kind of look like. And then from there, you can kind of dive into each of the libraries that may interest you. And sometimes it's just an interesting idea to say, well, I've been working with Angular for a while, let's see what else is out there, and just get an understanding for how a similar concept can be approached within each individual library. So for Angular, we'll be covering components, which actually is more or less the same for all the different libraries that we're working with. We'll be covering dependency injection, property bindings, and TypeScript, because that is a big part about Angular. So components, I can more or less confidently say that everything in Angular is a component. So even the application itself, the root of the application is actually a component, and every view that we have there, so whether it's a custom element or if it's an overall single page application, we have a couple different views. Everything is a component and a set of components. So you kind of have a component tree going from that root out to everything that we had to work with out of the box from Angular, or of course something we create ourselves. There are other aspects of Angular, of course, that aren't components, but a lot of the things that we'll be writing as developers specifically deal with components. And data flows in through an input property and out through an output property, which kind of makes sense. And what we can kind of see here is a component that actually has some bindings here. We can see that we have a selector for it, right? That's called my app. And from the my app, we can see that it can be used later in another component with my-app as the kind of tag. So this gives us a way to take a piece of functionality and kind of isolate it and make it its own kind of module, and then from there be able to reuse that either in other similar modules or just in the main overall application, of course. Now, every component has a lifecycle that's managed by Angular. So if we create a component, we automatically take advantage of the lifecycle that Angular provides. And from that lifecycle, there are various hooks that we take advantage of. So each component has this kind of set of hooks that at any point in time, just events essentially that we can subscribe to in order to be able to do something within that component. So just by declaring a component, just by creating a new component, we automatically have this kind of lifecycle that Angular applies to it. And whether if it's when we initialize the application and the view and the component, or when we destroy the components, let's say we're navigating to a separate view or whatever it might be, there might be some aspects of the component that we want to be able to update or tweak or whatever it might be whenever one of these things happens. Now, I was talking about input and output properties. So input properties are essentially the way that we kind of deal with and allow to transfer data between one component to the next. So, for example, in this particular case, right, we can see that we have an image tag where we can bind to the source a couple of different ways. So the first approach using the double bracket syntax here is interpolation that can be used if your property is a string. So if, in this case, my profile pic, for example, is a URL, we can very easily be able to just bind to it through these double brackets here. Using the square brackets on the attribute can be used in scenarios where it's not a plain string. So if we want to maybe have a return value that pops back from a function or whatever it might be, we could potentially use something like that here. And the bind dash attribute is actually the same approach as number 2, which just might be a little bit easier to read with the square brackets because we're dealing with attributes that we're probably pretty used to. Now, this is something that we're doing actually in the same component that we had above, but what we can think about as well is that while yes, this is an image tag, this would be the same thing actually if you pass some particular data from a component that is available to maybe a custom component that you have created. You'll be passing information in the same way. Now, output properties are usually events emitted by the component. So in this particular case, we'll see that we have a click event here, right, where we have the ability to vote. And we have the vote true or false here, and you can see here on voting, you can actually emit the event. So you see that we have an @output tag here on voting, and we have a new event emitter. So if I'm in a child component and I want to be able to push out, let's say something happens within that child component, I want the parent to be able to react to it, I can pass in an event and then from there also say, okay, when this event happens, so let's emit this event, and then it will push data back out into the parent. So instead of having two-way binding between a parent component and a child component, Angular and a lot of the frameworks that we're taking a look at today kind of deal with one-way binding generally, and two-way is kind of reserved for input elements, and then we also tend to kind of work with events to emit something back, or maybe even a service layer in order to be able to push data and kind of keep state. Generally, we're not doing a ton of two-way binding between components. Now, dependency injection. This is a whole topic that can take potentially some time to explain, but I'll try to do it here very quickly. So I actually took a scenario from the Angular documentation, and this is something that we'll see a ton of throughout Angular, right? So if we take this example, we have a class of car that has engine, tires, and a description. And then in the constructor, so when this gets initialized, we have this.engine equals a new engine, and this.tires equals a new tire. So every single time that we create a new car, we are creating its own copy of engine and tires. This is kind of brittle, though, if engine or tires needs changing. And what if we want to have a different set of tires on the car? What if we want to have a slightly different engine in each individual car? I can't really do that because we're just constantly creating a new version of engine and a new version of tires here in this constructor without being able to kind of change that. I would more or less have to create a bunch of different car classes with these different engines. So there's no flexibility with customizing a car, engine, or a tire at any point throughout this kind of setup. So with dependency injection, what we can do is that we can actually take the constructor and we can pass in an engine and pass in tires. And now we're consuming engine and tires, not necessarily creating them. And this allows us to pass in instances. So we can, for example, either pass the new engine and new tire, or if we already have existing versions of engine and tire, we can pass those in. And we can do something like this, for example, where we create a brand new engine class that actually allows us to pass in a number of cylinders that we want to be able to have for the engine. And we can now create a new car using that syntax. So dependency injection is not necessarily something that's new, and it's not necessarily something that's unique to Angular, but it is something that we see constantly across Angular applications, and a concept that we should definitely dive into when we start taking a look at Angular. Now, TypeScript, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, so I'll kind of cover this quickly. But TypeScript is a typed superset of JavaScript that compiles to plain JavaScript. So it brings static typing and structuring to JavaScript, something that some folks are kind of find to be missing, and tended to help build large and complex web applications. So this is oftentimes picked up by enterprise groups. It's very familiar to folks that are developing C#, and we also see a lot of folks on the Java side that kind of like that static typing to pick this up on the client side of things. And Angular has actually standardized on TypeScript from the beginning. So yes, you can work with plain JavaScript if you want to, but TypeScript tends to be the primary citizen. So you'll see a lot of samples written in TypeScript. A lot of the community is writing, blogs and articles and resources and sample applications in TypeScript. So it is kind of going hand in hand with Angular. Now, in order to go ahead and get started, so let's say we kind of get a grasp of that, right? The easiest way to get started is through the Angular CLI. Angular can be kind of complicated to set up because of from scratch, because Angular itself, you have to customize a little bit to be able to output the application. You also probably need to work with something like Webpack and Babel, etc., in order to be able to go from TypeScript, compile that down, right? We need to have a compilation step because of this, and to be able to actually release this onto the client. And the CLI helps us create new projects, sets everything up for us, even with unit tests and everything like that. So out of the box, you set it up with Webpack and you're kind of off to the races. So all that you need to do is using npm, pretty easy. You can just do npm install -g and then @Angular CLI. Then you have access to the command line of using ng whatever it might be, so ng new app, cd my app, ng serve, and --open actually allows us to launch the application in the browser. And then you can just use ng serve, of course, but that --open actually brings it up into the current browser. So let's just quickly take a look at the sample code for Angular. So what I've done in each application is this. You have an items list here of something that you might be able to find in the office. So let's say we can do keyboard. I can hit add item, and then we'll go ahead and add that. And I can also then say mouse, for example, because that happens to be in front of me. Boom, there we go. We have that added into the list here. Now, the way that this can work is we'll take a look at, let me just close this README file right here. What I have is a folder here of various different folders of the different applications that we're taking a look at. So we have the Angular app here, and I'll take a look at the source. We won't dive too much into it because everything that you see here is automatically generated by the CLI for us. And if I go into the application folder here, this is where all the kind of magic is. So first of all, we have the HTML file here. We also have a CSS file that I could potentially use if I wanted to do something specifically for this component. The CSS that I have in my application is actually in styles.css, which is a general CSS file for my entire application. But this app.component.css allows me to do a kind of scoped style for this particular component. And then what kind of brings all this together here is this app.component.ts. So you see the app.component.ts, app.component.html, app.component.css, and this is just a part of the style guide for Angular for creating a component. Essentially, app.component.x will allow you to be able to kind of say that, okay, all this is a part of a single component. What you do is you pass in here in the component, you have the selector, so that gives you app-root, so that's the tag that we use. You have template URL, which gives you the HTML file that you want to be using here, then as well as the styles URL. So this is just a way for us to be able to work with and kind of create these isolated components. Now, how to go ahead and add this? Pretty easy. We have just a title here for the overall title of the application, have an array of items, the 3 items that we saw here. And then I have this event here that's just add item, passes in a string, and then from here we simply just go ahead and calculate a new ID here and then push in the item. So very simple, right? We're just working with an array and pushing that information in. Now the syntax, what this looks like here on the Angular side of things, we are just binding the title here using the curly braces because again, we're just using a plain string here, right? There's no need to work with anything additional beyond that. Here, you'll see that I have this hashtag new item, and this just kind of gives us input and ID, a reference that we can work with. And we're actually using that then here within the button on the click event. We just pass in the function that we have within the components TypeScript file, and then we just do new item, so this reference that we have here, dot value, and this is how we get that string available in the add item function. Now, once we do that, of course, this will go ahead and work with the code that we've written out here to go ahead and add items into the list items. And Angular has a set of these attributes that we can work with, so ng-for, ng-if, a ton of different ng, whatever it might be, that allows us to create some functionality in these templates that, for example, iterates over a set of items in an array. And then from there, we simply just say, okay, in each of these list item items, so let item of list items, we'll just go ahead and extract the text field. I can, of course, also go ahead and input if I want some unique values, for example, for each list item. I could provide in an ID or a key or whatever it might be. So nothing too crazy there. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to immediately be jumping back into the slide deck that we have here. Now, let's take a look at React, right? There's going to be a ton of different libraries for us to cover, so we'll be kind of switching context here pretty quickly. So just a quick history of React, right? Created by Facebook, initially released in 2013. We have the current version, which is 15.6.1. We actually have a rewrite happening of the React core, which is underway, which is called React Fiber. So some of you might have heard of that. Essentially, with React 16, we're going to be using React Fiber, but React Fiber is just a rewrite to help improve the underlying performance of React, kind of trim things down. And while React has been around since 2013, of course, a lot of things have changed between then, and React has tried to keep up with that, but kind of an underlying framework rewrite needed to happen. The nice thing about it is that we can actually use React 16 today. It's actually a release candidate that we can work with. And it's not like you have to change code that much. If you're working from AngularJS 1.x over to 2, there's a lot of rewrites that you have to do in kind of a migration process. What's nice about going from 15 to 16 is that there might be some breaking changes, but it's not going to be as crazy as we see on the Angular side. And something that you might have not heard of, but is very big news this week, is that as of September 22nd of 2017, this is now licensed under MIT. So React is licensed under MIT as opposed to the BSD and patent clause that they've had previously. So that's kind of a big deal for some of those people either working with React currently and might have had some issues with the license, or folks that were looking at React and weren't 100% sure what they wanted to do based on that license. Now some React overall usage stats. So it has 75,000 stars on GitHub, actually. It has around 5 million or so NPM downloads per month, and it has almost 721,000, there we go. That's how you say numbers. Downloads of the React developer tool. So again, a Chrome extension that allows you to be able to inspect React applications, not just necessarily inspect the just pure HTML that's available. So quite a lot of downloads, probably the largest library that we're looking at today, and it kind of continues to grow. Now, React has a couple core concepts. It has a virtual DOM, which I'm sure you've heard of. JSX is also a very big part of React. Components, again, so just like within Angular, similar to how we have the input properties there, it also has props that you want to work with. Also, each React component has state, which I'll cover as well. There's a lifecycle, and let's just go ahead and jump straight into it. So the virtual DOM, you might have heard about this, right? But the virtual DOM is a node tree, just like the DOM is a node tree. So if you're familiar with how the DOM works within a web browser, it's very similar, but it's all virtual. So there's a list of elements, an attribute, and content that exists as JavaScript objects with properties. When you go ahead and call render, so each React component has a render function. It actually goes ahead and creates a node tree from that React component, whether it's just one single component or if you're rendering child components as well. It kind of lists out this whole tree. And it also updates that same tree whenever data models are changed, so whenever you update state or change anything within the component. And then from there, React updates the real DOM in 3 steps. So whenever something's changed, the virtual DOM will re-render. Then the difference between the old virtual DOM and new virtual DOM will be calculated. And then from there, the real DOM will be updated based on these changes. So instead of constantly having to work with the real DOM, which is very expensive, everything is kind of handled virtually until you absolutely need to update the DOM. And at that point, you go ahead and do that expensive call. Now JSX, it's officially an XML-like syntax that is close, but not quite HTML. It's actually JavaScript with HTML sprinkled in, so you can kind of see this HTML in JS kind of associated with it. So it's often just syntactical sugar to something like this. So instead of working with what you see here, React.create element component props children, you'll see something like working with my button here, right, which you have a simple tag from, and you can see that it all stems from this React.create element. So instead of having the frustration of creating an element by hand, you'll see that my button, which is a component of ours that has a couple different attributes that we pass in, we don't have to deal with creating the element and then defining the tag and passing in all the attributes and everything like that. And now components, just like with Angular, right? Let's just split the UI into independent reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. And really, components are like JavaScript functions, right? So you have an arbitrary amount of inputs, so the props, and then you return the React elements. So you're always returning a render function that has the elements that you want to display. So very simple to begin with, but you can quickly get kind of advanced with this. The render function is really key here because every component will have a render function. So you'll see here, apologize for the resolution here, but you have the function welcome props here. You can also write it as a class welcome. You can see here extends React.component in the ES6 way if you want to work a little bit more with classes. So here we return a simple HTML element, and here the same thing within render, right? This is just a little bit more syntax thrown in, but you're passing back an HTML element. So props, this is what gives our components and attributes overall properties. So this is how you pass in data. This is how you deal with various different attributes. So here, for example, right, the props that we're dealing with, as we see here, the shopping list name, pass in my name here for Carl. We'll be able to use that, so this props.name while rendering this particular component. So this is just kind of a way to pass data in and out. Each component has a state, and it actually manages its own state as well. So this can be extracted and set in our codes. As developers, we're actually responsible for updating and dealing with state. So you see here that in the beginning, when we create this clock component, in the constructor, we have this .state. We pass in a new date, and then below here, you can actually output that in the render function. You can also work with, for example, adding items, which you'll see by setting the state and extracting the state pretty easily. Just like within Angular, we have life cycles for each component. So you have mounting, updating, and unmounting. You have a full list of different lifecycle hooks that we can subscribe to. So the constructor, for example, can help us set up the initial state, and then from there, there's some other, of course, events that we can hook into. Now, React, the easiest way to get started is through create React app CLI. So that's the official React CLI, and then we can create a new app, and that bootstraps the entire application. So just like with Angular, npm install -g, create React app, and then go ahead and kick things off with npm start. So npm start just runs through a custom npm script to kick off the app. Nice and easy. Let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like. So popping over into our sample application, it will be the exact same application as we saw before, just with React. Pop into the source here. We'll see that we have app.css, which is what houses all of my CSS for this particular application and this particular app. But what I'll also do here is just pop into app.js, because this is really what drives our entire application. So what we'll see is that within my constructor here, I've defined this .title, and then this .state, I passed in two things. One is value, and one is the list item. So just like we had before, we had the desk chair and the coffee cup. And then if I scroll down a little bit to actually the JSX here, we'll see what the HTML equivalent in Angular looks like here by seeing that we have this div element that it happens to, every component needs to pass back just one root element. So we wrap it all in a div. We bind, so we're just using single brackets here instead of the double brackets. And then we'll see here that we have the value of my input is actually bound to this .state.value. And then on change, we do this handle change, which actually calls this .setState, which allows me set the state, and update the value of that input. So now if I type in anything in here and I change that with the input, automatically my state will be updated to reflect the new item. Then on the button side of things, I can, of course, subscribe to onClick. We have this at add item. And in add item, again, we just work with the value. So as long as we have a value in our state, we just create a new array and we push the items in there and then go ahead and set the state again to update the state. The one thing that you'll notice about React is what we have here is this kind of map of the rendered items. So I can execute JavaScript code in here because JSX is just JavaScript with HTML thrown in. However, what we will notice here is that we have the rendered items and we do a map, which if you're not familiar with the JavaScript map function, it just kind of allows me to iterate over an array and transform it or do something with each individual item. In this particular case, we'll go ahead and create a list item here that we can work with. Now, React specifically requires a key attribute when you have an unordered list, because this key attribute allows us to be able to very easily understand what the diff is between the actual DOM and the virtual DOM. So we can kind of see this as a unique way for React to understand, okay, this item got updated, or this item got added. So that's why we'll just use the ID of each item, and then we'll bind the actual text of the list item to item.text. So pretty similar to what we did in Angular. Really the only big difference here is these rendered items. And probably what I would do if I had a little bit more time and wanted to be proper about this, I create a separate component and then pass in the key and pass in the item text and then render that component separately. So we don't necessarily have this whole structure right within our JSX here. So the return statement that we have for the app. All right, so that's React. Let's go ahead and truck on here with the next item, which is Vue.js. So just some history about Vue. So it was created by Evan You. Initially intended as little Angular, so he saw a couple of things within Angular when he worked at Google, I believe, and said, you know what, there's some things that I like about it, but I don't necessarily think that we need everything within Angular. So that was kind of the original intention. First commit was June 27, 2013, and then it's gone through 2 major releases, so 1.x and currently on 2.x. Vue is oftentimes just called a Vue library, but it's actually quite a bit more, and we'll go into detail as to why. The current release is on 2.4.4, and of course it continues to truck on here. But some usage stats for Vue. We have about 67,000 stars on GitHub. We have over 680,000 NPM downloads per month, and then we have about 560,000 downloads of the Vue developer tools. Again, a Chrome extension that helps us deal with Vue. One note that I should make about Vue is that it is one of the fastest growing libraries. So if you look at it week over week, Vue happens to be growing the fastest out of all the ones that I'm bringing up here today. Now, Vue has some core concepts, of course. One is that it's called a progressive framework, and I'll go into detail as in why. Also list out some additional support libraries to kind of go hand in hand with that. Again, we have components, a very, very important approach to all these libraries. Vue also allows you to do what's called a single file component, which I'll dive into as well. So the progressive framework, why is this really called this way? Well, Vue, the core of it, is built to be minimalist and small. Again, think little Angular, right? Angular was a little bit too big. So more features and functionality are added by other frameworks. It's not kind of a framework that has absolutely everything baked in. So progressive comes from tacking on frameworks as needed. So you have the core, then you might add the router, then you might add this part of it, another part of it, for example. So instead of doing the whole kitchen sink thing, you can include this in stages. Also makes it very simple to use initially. In fact, you'll see you can just drop a JavaScript file on your page and start using Vue immediately. You don't have to do a complicated setup whatsoever, but then you can make this as complex as you need it to be. So you don't even need to do any builds. You can just drop it in Vue.js, and you can start writing with this app, the ID here. You can start binding with the curly brackets, and you can start working with Vue immediately within your application. Now, there's a ton of different support libraries you can use. So, you have the Vue CLI, you have the Vue router, Vue loader for Webpack, you have the Vue style loader, again, for styles, Vuex, which is essentially Redux, but specifically for Vue. You have RxJS support, all this kind of stuff that you can just go out and grab from the GitHub repository for Vue that's kind of officially listed and supported there. Now, components, of course, just like with the other pieces, right? Small, self-contained, and reusable parts of an application. And we can see just here how we have an order list with my item here. And my item, you see here that the template that we provide is just a simple one single list item, for example. Now, they have a data attribute, which adds objects to the reactivity system, and I'll talk a little bit about what that reactivity system is. But each object that gets added to data, so essentially, so what we have here, instead of this template attribute, it's just a data attribute, will have its properties converted to getters and setters. So you'll see what I mean by that when I cover the sample code. Now, this just kind of talks about the components and how the reactivity kind of works, right? And I'm not going to go through this specifically. I just wanted to throw in the slide deck here because it's a very simple way to approach things that Vue has kind of managed to tackle in a very minimalist way. Now, we also have a single file component aspect that actually has a template at the top, so just using the HTML template tag. Then if we scroll down, we have a script tag specifically of the model for this view, so just for this view. And here we can see that data attribute that we can define. We can have the message, and this now it has a getter and setter that we can update. And we can even have a styled scope specifically for this component. So this allows us to not even have multiple different files. So everything is defined in one single file, and it allows me to know exactly what's happening within this component at an initial quick glance. So to get started, there's a simple start where you just go ahead and throw in Vue.js into any application, or you can work with a more advanced start and work with the Vue CLI. You don't necessarily need to work with Webpack, again, because Vue is so kind of simplistic in its initial installation and pickup, that Webpack might be an overhead of complex items that you don't necessarily need, but you can still work with the CLI and do Vue init and then the templates on Webpack or System.js, whatever it might be, and you can go ahead and get things started from there. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So within my Vue application here, I'll pop into the source. We'll see that we have app.vue, where I go ahead and just import a component called hello. Hello is here, so this is just the basic start that we have from the CLI. But in hello.vue, we can now see that I have the template set up in a very similar fashion to what I've done in the other applications. We have the header here, where I do the two curly braces to bind to just a simple string here with a name we see here, and then we have that here. And then I have these ideas of a v-model, a v-on, so you'll see that's kind of how we bind to specific items or define things within Vue. It'll be a v-whatever it might be. And this is the syntax that Vue has specifically for dealing with events. So this model allows me to be able to say, okay, for the input new item, so within my data tag here, or a data attribute, I should say, of this particular view, I have the title that I can work with, and then also the new item right here. So right now it's blank, but of course when this gets updated, the model gets updated, and then this gets updated as well. And then we have the list items here that we can deal with. So everything that I want to bind either one way, like I'm doing here with the title, or two ways, for example, with the model here, I go ahead and define within the data here. Then I can go ahead and define a list of methods for my component, and in this particular case, I'm working with the add item. Again, all I'm doing is pushing to the array, and then it'll automatically go ahead and update my HTML from that. So very simple to set up, and here I just threw in a styled scope just for the sake of it. But what's important about this, right, is that we're not necessarily going through and creating some very advanced component, and we don't have to have this large infrastructure. I could create all of this by just creating a client-side object called default, just var default, and have the name, the data, the methods attached to it, and then throw in this similar syntax into an already existing application and be off to the races. So Vue is a very good library to either pick up if you're a single developer and you kind of want to just understand some of these frameworks, or for some larger applications as well, you have some benefit of working with Vue because you can drop this into your existing application, start taking advantage of Vue without necessarily having to rewrite your entire application. So Vue is gaining a lot of popularity for each of those kind of camps, and that's kind of why you see a lot of people talking about Vue just because of its inherent simplicity to begin with, and then how just complex and advanced you can get as you continue to go along within development. Let's go ahead and continue on trekking here, since we do have 2 more frameworks to cover before the time is out today. Let's talk about Ember. With the lovely little squirrel here, or hamster, I guess, as the logo. So just as some quick history, I'm probably going to mispronounce this name, but it was created by Yehuda Katz and initially released in December 18th of 2011. It's one of the older libraries that we're taking a look at today. And this is really a true MVVM single-page application framework, similar to the era of Durandal and Knockout, et cetera, back in the day. This is really kind of keeps that real MVVM style. It isn't just an MV star kind of framework. It did have a huge refresh with 2.0 to kind of modernize it a little bit, bring it into a similar area to where we are today. So one-way data flow is now the default, similar to how it is in Angular, React, and Vue. You have built-in tools for reloading, automatic browser refreshes, and you have a standard lifecycle hook for all the components that you have available. And the current release is 2. Actually, I should update this because it is 2.15. As of today, even 16 actually. So it's a mobile usage. You have 18,000 stars on GitHub, 340,000 npm downloads per month, and about 70,000 or so downloads of the Ember developer tools in Chrome. I'm just specifically sticking with Chrome, but there are of course other tools available across these libraries for other browsers as well. Now some core concepts. You have the router and route handlers. You have templates, models, components. They will see that makes a comeback. So let's just jump straight into router and route handlers. So Ember uses routes as a way to represent the state of the application. As opposed to a lot of other kind of frameworks that we're looking at here, routes deal with a lot of what you're seeing within Ember. So each URL has a connected route object that controls what to display. That then is actually, depending on how the user, of course, interacts and adds that URL, the Ember router takes a URL, maps it to that route handler. Now that route object renders a template, and then that route handler then loads a model available for the template. So the route handler is really in charge of connecting the view that we have to our view model, and of course the underlying model as well. So this is why almost every time you get started with an Ember, you're going ahead and you're defining a bunch of different routes. Now, templates, of course, they're what build the application's HTML. Everything that the user interacts with is provided through this template. And Ember actually uses HTML bars, which is a compiler for handlebars. But instead of just what handlebar does is essentially define a string and then evaluate that string to create the DOM elements. Here, we actually are designed to build DOM instead of strings. So this allows us to be able to have a context of the parents, siblings, and attributes that exist within these particular components, as opposed to just being kind of individual strings. So any handlebar syntax is valid within Ember. So for example, here we have just double brackets, right? So that's a simple, sorry about that. That's a simple Ember template. Now, models with Ember, they're the ones that persist state across the application for each individual view, of course. So model, or potentially multiple views, right, depending on how we set that up. Models contain the data associated with the current state of the application. Every route has an associated model. Models are in charge of saving the data to the storage of choice, whether that's database or in memory, whatever it might be. So really, models are what provide our data. Within components, the components in Ember are pretty much like the ones we discussed so far, right? They consist of 2 parts, a template written in HTML bars, and then a JavaScript file defining the component's behavior. Components own their own data, so they are kind of in charge of everything that relates to them, and then they can be nested and communicate with their parents and children. So, for example, from parent to child, you have bindings, from child to parent events. Very similar to what Angular is doing things, and actually React is doing things, and Vue as well, right? You bind something to push it into a child, and then the event gets emitted, and that's how it flows up into the parent. Now, libraries like Polymer can be used with Ember because you're just using, essentially HTML within these components, and it's kind of flexible for integrating with additional libraries if need be. To get started, the easiest route to work with, pun intended, is through the Ember CLI. So you can create new projects with a quick command, and you can actually set up, like we see here, npm install -g ember CLI, and then we have the Ember command to work with. Now, the Ember command, aside from just serving the application, also can be used to set up components, to set up routes, to set up models, and this actually takes care of a lot of things within our application and simplifies working with the application structure. And let me show you what that looks like. So on the Ember side of things, we'll see here, so let me close this down, that we actually have within my application folder, we have quite a lot, and it can be a little bit confusing to take a look at initially. But we see here that I have a templates folder, I have a components folder, and then within the templates folder, I also have a components folder. So if we look into application, this outlet here, just kind of how the router deals with rendering anything that we want to be able to have in the application, specifically that template, so the main app, so I won't worry too much about that. But what I do have is this items.hbs, so items.handlebars, right? And here we see that I'm creating with these curly braces here, item-list with a title of Ember app, and then I'm passing in a model. So what this is this is actually a component that I call item-list. We'll see here that I can open that up. And in here, I bind to that title. I also work with one of their helpers to create an input element that I can bind to. Then I can also define events by using the double curly braces here and adding an action. And then I'm using some handlebar syntax to render each one of those individual items. Now, the way this looks in my application overall, so how do I get, what is that model and everything? Well, I define a model here that is really just a way to define a schema. In this particular case, I passed in just text because we automatically get an ID from working with the model within Ember. And then if I go into my components, so this is essentially the components folder here is for the kind of code behind, quote unquote, while the components folder down here is for the template. Here we see that I'm doing a couple different things. First, of course, I create the component. This store here is just working with the built-in services within Ember in order to be able to pull in data, to create data, and whatever it might be. And in this particular case, when my application kicks off, I go ahead and create my sample data, and then I inject it here using the store, and then I can very easily then just work with store to get items, and then go ahead and create a record to pass that information back here with an add item. Now, if I go into routes, because again, routes is what ties everything together, this is where you see how this kind of comes together. So root specifically for items, so /items, would allow me to pass in this model, right? So I actually create the model and push this data into the store. And then here I just return the store of find all of items, and that's kind of how I get that information back to ultimately go into the items list. Actually, if I into items.hbs here, pass them item-list with this model, because /items is tied to the /items handlebars template. The thing is tied into the item list that I display here. So you have to rethink a little bit compared to the other libraries. You have to think of everything as depending on URLs, as opposed to necessarily just creating a bunch of components and figuring out how they're interacting with each other. Everything through Ember is really driven through the URLs. All right, we have one last library to take a peek at here. So let's take a look at Aurelia. So Aurelia, and I'm sure you can pronounce it a couple different names, right? But Aurelia was originally created by Rob Eisenberg. First release was in January 26th of 2015, and it was intended as a next generation version of Durandal, another library that he had worked on. This is also a true MVVM framework, and this was created after Rob left the team, the Angular team specifically, to start Aurelia, and the current release is on 1.1.4. Now, some overall usage stats, so there's over 10,000 stars on GitHub, 25,000 NPM downloads per month, and about 2,000 or so downloads of the Aurelia Inspector. There's a couple of other different developer tools, but this is kind of one of the main ones for Aurelia. Some core concepts, it's a collection of modules, so I'll talk a little bit about that. Again, components, binding, and templates. So a collection of modules. So Aurelia aims to not be a monolithic framework. Again, kind of similar to how Vue does it, right? It wants to be kind of minimalistic. So it's broken down into a collection of feature-oriented modules. So you have metadata, dependency injection, templating, routing, etc. But all these modules aren't necessarily needed out of the box. You kind of just add them as you need to. And now each module is written with JavaScript. Yeah, so ES Next, right? So ES6 or whatever it might be, or TypeScript, and then everything is built on open web standards. So it carefully follows the DOM standard, and there's no real abstraction over the DOM. So you really, alongside with learning Aurelia or working with Aurelia, are learning a lot about how HTML functions, and really working with the ES Next and TypeScript. Now, components in Aurelia are just composed of a view and a view model. And they're written in HTML and rendered in the DOM, of course. The view model is written in ES 2016 or TypeScript, and then you can work with the templating engine and dependency injection kind of enforces this pair between the view and the view model, and also ultimately grants us a lifecycle to the components, similar to how we see within the other frameworks. Now, binding, you can support binding in HTML and SVG attributes via JS expression. So the way this kind of works here is that you have an element, and then you pass in the attribute.command equals the expression. So for example, you have the href.bind, and then you pass it into the particular field that you want to be able to bind to. You can also do various commands within these bindings. So you have value.bind. This will be automatically be a one-way binding. Then you have the value.two-way. So this is just a two-way binding. So if you have an input, for example, and you want to be able to grab data back and forth, you have two-way. And then you can also do specifically define it as one-way, or you can do -one time. So these are the kind of commands that you have on top of just each attribute you can do something with, but you can also have commands that go along with that particular attribute. Templates, so Aurelia, just like we saw in Vue, they actually take advantage of the HTML template element. Uses the $ and then bracket syntax for interpolation. So this is actually standards-based ES 2015 and beyond syntax. So this is how you'll be able to already work with just plain Jane JavaScript if you wanted to. It's tied to a view model to supply data. So in this particular case, right, we have arriving here is actually available on my view model, and then depending on what we see here, we can kind of either say hello or goodbye, and then pass in a name, for example. Oops, there we go. So getting started, again, it's pretty easy to get started with Aurelia. There's a couple different ways. There's a getting started guide that allows you to throw in a simple tag setup, so that's very easy to work with. They also have a ton of skeleton projects, so you can just download, open up, and then from there go ahead and kick things off. And that's actually how I went ahead and worked with the project that I have here. Or you can work with the Aurelia CLI, similar to how we have the Ember CLI and all the other CLIs. This takes a couple additional steps to set up, but it's actually still pretty easy to work with. So this is yet another way to go ahead and kickstart your applications. So some sample code on the Aurelia side. If I close down what I have here in Ember, let's go ahead and close not tabs to the left, close all tabs. And then within the Aurelia app here, I'll go into my source. And again, we have app.html, and this is just set up a little bit with a router already. I took some of that code out for this project, but we still have one particular route that we deal with as the main route. But then we have items.html and items.js. So this is the template and the view, and then the view model associated with it. So in this particular case, I have my title, I have my item value, and then I have the list items like we've seen before. And within add item, I just do exactly what we've been doing so far, right? Go ahead and grab the new ID. I do a quick parse and everything here, and just push in the new element into this list item of items right here. Within the HTML, this is fairly simple. Again, we use the $ and open and close curly braces, just like we were talking about. We have this value.two-way binding on the input that I'm dealing with, right? Because we want to be able to extract the information and push it in if we want to as well. And then we have the way for us to be able to trigger events is through this click.trigger, and there's a bunch of different other commands that we can work with. But click.trigger, just to make sure that when we click on this, it triggers the add item function. And then we have this repeat.for in order to be able to go into all of our list items, display an item, and use the binding syntax there. So if I wanted to just throw this into, script tag into my application, again, I can kind of take a simplistic approach with Aurelia and be able to do some very, standards-based approach here of dealing with all my content, right? I don't have to necessarily go ahead and create this long, big project. I'm working with standards-based HTML and JavaScript. It just so happens that Aurelia is kind of driving a lot of the functionality here. All right. I do have just a quick summary, but I see that we have just a couple of minutes left. So what I wanted to do is cover the overall user experience within these frameworks, right? So we covered a lot of different content within these frameworks. Nothing too crazy, of course, but I wanted to be able to give everybody a high-level look at what we have available within each one of these frameworks, just as a kind of 101 kind of piece. But I wanted to do one quick shameless plug as well, and that is talk about Kendo UI, the library that I'm responsible for. So these frameworks are great for building applications, of course. A ton of different apps can be built with them. But what about the overall user experience, right? How do you build complex forms, data grids, add charts, and create these rich, wonderful dashboards that people want to work with? Well, you can work with Kendo UI. So we have over 70 UI components that can actually integrate into existing jQuery applications, AngularJS and Angular, React, Vue, and Aurelia. So every single framework that we talked about today, except for Ember. Ember, you would have to do a little bit of additional customization to get into, but you can still go ahead and take any one of these frameworks that we have here, and from there, of course, you'll be able to go ahead and add some very complex and additional kind of UI on top of what you already have existing. So now I know that we have an overall Q&A session and we're right up against the hour. So what we'll kind of do is I'll let everybody go ahead and type in some questions here as I'm talking. And what we'll do is that we'll follow up after the webinar and we'll go ahead and kind of answer the questions through that, just because I know that a lot of people are looking to kind of jump out of here and be able to get running to the next meeting. So what we'll do is we'll just follow up after the webinar if you have any and all sort of questions via email, and then of course we'll be able to follow up with the overall source of this project, the slide deck, and all the wonderful links that I might have had in here. But I wanted to thank everybody for joining me today in this webinar. I know that we covered a lot. I spoke kind of quickly. I wanted to cover a lot of these components, but we managed to fill it all in within the hour. So I appreciate everybody sticking around and talking with us today. So thank you again, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.